want you to hit me as hard as you can.
Hey everybody, it's Chris Bumbray here again with another video edition of The Best Movie You Never Saw, and this week we're taking a look at the 80s classic, kinda, LadyHawke. Now this is directed by Richard Donner, and it was a movie that he made right before The Goonies and Lethal Weapon, and it stars Matthew Broderick in a piece of casting that only ever could have been done in the 80s as a French pickpocket in 13th century Europe who becomes embroiled in an epic romance where a knight, played by Rutger Hauer, and a beautiful woman, played by Michelle Pfeiffer, attempt to break the curse that keeps them apart. Now, when we think of somebody like Richard Donner, we think of action movies typically. He's really one of the classic journeyman directors of his era, and I'd say he's probably one of the most successful directors in Hollywood history. He was a late bloomer, and he started out concentrating on movie making only in his late 40s after he'd already had a really long career directing TV. Recently, he did an authorized biography called You're the Director, You Figure It Out, and Donner's craft is explained as a dedication to verisimilitude. Now, by this verisimilitude, he means a dedication to reality, or at least the reality of the world that he's depicting. That's why his Superman the movie holds up so well, and why Lethal Weapon managed to sustain such a long franchise.
Diplomatic community.
Just been revoked.
He knows how to entertain, but his movies are never too much, and this is a lesson that many modern blockbuster directors would do well to learn. Even if the stuff is outlandish, you still believe it in a weird way. Yet Donner's had a couple of movies of his that don't quite work. Some of them are excellent little scene gems like this movie called Inside Moves, while others are full-on train wrecks that can't really be defended, such as his troubled timeline or The Botched Assassins. One of the biggest financial disappointments of his career was the 1985 sword and sorcery epic LadyHawke. Now, coming off of a time where Conan the Barbarian, Excalibur, and other swordplay movies were doing pretty well and were relatively hot, everyone kinda thought that LadyHawke would do big business. But it was a really troubled production. Even though his career was pretty hot at the time, Donner had a hard time lining up an A-list cast. He wanted Sean Connery for the heroic knight Navarre, and then Mel Gibson, but eventually he settled on Kurt Russell, who apparently got one look at himself in medieval garb and quit the film. Given that Michelle Pfeiffer was largely unknown at the time, this was her follow-up to Scarface, and that his second choice, Rutger Hauer, was more of a cult actor than a legit star, he needed a really big name to play the third lead, that of the heroic thief Philip the Mouse. Dustin Hoffman turned him down, and Sean Penn's method acting just drove everybody crazy. So eventually he settled on Matthew Broderick, who was riding high off of War Games. Now, the box office for this movie was really disappointing. Harvey Bernhard, who produced the movie, said in an interview that Warner Brothers just didn't release it right. He said that they should have just released the picture as a love story in a handful of theaters and let it build, but instead they went for a wide release. Now, as a result of the low-key but pretty appropriate cast, LadyHawke totally got lost at the box office, losing out to Police Academy 2 in its third week, as well as Mask and the now obscure Cat's Eye at the box office, making only $18 million domestic total. It was a total flop, but luckily Donner bounced back immediately with The Goonies, and then moved on to Lethal Weapon, while LadyHawke would inspire a modest cult following, even if it remains largely obscure to non-devotees of fantasy cinema. Now, LadyHawke is a movie that often gets unfairly maligned as cheesy, and it's all due to one really bad creative choice that Richard Donner made early on, and his instincts are almost always spot on. But apparently Donner had been listening to the Alan Parsons Project on a loop while filming in Europe, and began to just completely associate the film with their music. So he absolutely insisted that they do the score, and Tangerine Dream they are not. Here's an excerpt from Donner's authorized biography, You're the Director, You Figure It Out, The Life and Films of Richard Donner by James Christie. Of all the post-production difficulties, it was the musical scoring of the film that ultimately caused the most stress and tension. No fucking way, Stuart Baird, the editor, screamed defiantly. You've got to listen, the director assured, throwing down a dozen albums by the pop group The Alan Parsons Project on a work desk. It's gonna be this cool thing. If ever there was a picture that cried out for Jerry Goldsmith, sighed the late Tom Mankiewicz, the writer of the film. With hindsight, this was it. Now, of course, the Alan Parsons Project music is a disaster. I mean, an absolute disaster. There are some moments where the music really works, but oh my god, there are some moments where it's just awful, such as, I don't know, the opening credits. I mean, I don't know what Richard Donner was thinking, and it's the one thing that you kind of have to get over if you're going to appreciate this movie. I can imagine it was dated even in 1985. Probably Donner thought that it was a really commercial move, and I think also a lot of it has to do with the fact that he was falling in love while he was doing the movie with Lauren Schuler, who became his wife. And I think just, I don't know, Alan Parsons' project became this big romantic thing for him, and you'd have to think that he was just temporarily out of his mind. I mean, I don't know what he was thinking. But most importantly, it really violated his own policy of verisimilitude. You're not going to watch a movie set in 13th century Europe with Alan Parsons' project music and think that, oh, you're watching something that makes sense. It just doesn't fit at all. And it makes an excellent film prematurely dated. Even when I discovered this film on Arts and Entertainment, A&E, in the mid-90s before they just did Celebrity Rehab, I thought the soundtrack, other than a couple of cues by co-composer Raju Powell, was absolutely god-awful, and this was a time that I was obsessed with musical scores. It's too bad, because otherwise LadyHawke is a pretty good movie. For one thing, it's absolutely gorgeous to look at, with Vittorio Storaro's visuals giving this an epic look. The story is simple but romantic, with the curse being that the knight Navarre is human by day, but a wolf by night, with his lover Isabeau is a hawk by day, while she gets to be human by night. Thus, they're always together, never apart, and the cast is absolutely exceptional. Even if he wasn't big box office at the time, Rutger Hauer is such a compelling hero as the noble but flawed Navarre. He has an edge to him that his contemporaries just didn't have, but I think that's also one of the reasons why he didn't quite work as an action star in the 80s. Some of his follow-up movies like Wanted, Dead or Alive, or Blind Fury are really worth a look, but there was always this kind of edge, this insanity to Rutger Hauer that, made him seem almost like a better-looking Michael Shannon.
Like nothing you have ever seen!
This like matinee idol version of Michael Shannon, and I think that maybe limited him a bit. I bet if he was still making movies now, he'd be a lot more popular. Or if he was a young man now anyway, he'd be a lot more popular. Michelle Pfeiffer, however, absolutely perfect as the elegant, drop-dead gorgeous Isabeau, the face of love, as they say in the movie. Although, if anybody is really miscast in this film, I gotta say it's Matthew Broderick, who is so 1980s and so New York as the 13th century French thief. I mean, this is another example of Donner totally forgetting his whole policy of verisimilitude.
If you lay one hand on her, you will find it on the ground next to your head.
I mean, Matthew Broderick is very 1985, especially in, he's almost in Ferris Bueller mode here, even though it was before he did Ferris Bueller. The movie almost doesn't make sense when he's on screen. I mean, he's so 1985, they may as well have cast Boy George or Corey Hart in the lead. However, other than that small flaw, the movie is still pretty good. So you got not a great musical score and a miscast Matthew Broderick. But Rutger Hauer is great, Michelle Pfeiffer is great, and also great is Leo McKern in a really fun supporting role, as is the great Alfred Molina, who was at the beginning of his career. Now, if we're talking about best scenes in this movie, I think that Donner absolutely nailed the choreography and weaponry of the era, and the action scenes really rank with the best of the genre, even if they're kind of hampered by his PG-13 rating, although then again, in the 1980s, PG-13 was a lot more brutal than it is now. Now, here's a taste of a climactic battle, which goes on a lot longer, but would spoil the movie if we showed too much, where Rutger Hauer takes on the main henchman. If you want to see LadyHawke, it's pretty easily available. It's on Blu-ray, it's on DVD, and you can get it pretty cheaply on iTunes. Now, the thing is, like a lot of other films that I've talked about in this column, in this video column anyway, LadyHawke isn't a perfect movie. And it really is a product of its time. I mean, this is a very 1985 movie. However, it's also unjustly obscure, and I think pretty ripe for recovery, even if the soundtrack is so dated in a way that makes it seem cheesy. If you take the soundtrack away, it's actually not a cheesy movie. It's actually kind of a nice little fantasy romance. You could almost remake this movie scene for scene today with a better soundtrack, and I think it would be a big hit. But, alas, the movie's not perfect. It is what it is. I really like LadyHawke. I grew up watching it. I've always really enjoyed it, and I think a lot of you, especially fantasy fans, will really get a kick out of it if you haven't seen it yet. Until next time, I'm Chris Mumbre for JoBlo.com.